open. You can ask a question at any point. I don't like saving them all for the end. And if I'll stop from time to time while we're going through this to see if people want to ask a question like on audio too. But if you want to do a chat question, throw it in anytime.
And if you can just drop in chat that you can hear us, we want to make sure that people can hear us. That's always helpful to know. And if you're where you're from, or maybe what you're reading, or if you have a favorite book of Grady's that you've read, we'd love to see that in the chat too. So please feel free to drop that in. So just to get us started, Grady, what is the day in the life of an author like for you? I know you said you're coming up on working on a rewrite, but what else are you working? What else does your day look like? When do you get started? You're a morning person, night owl?
Oh yeah, I'm more of a morning person, but I run, this is my crummy little office. I am usually here about 8 in the morning till about 7 or 8 at night. And I just work. I usually split the day in half and do like the writing in one part and the emails, which seem interminable and incessant and never ending, in another part. But yeah, I mean, it's putting the butt in the chair and typing.
My understanding, that's the way to be most successful, is to do it every day or on a regular basis. Get that butt in the chair.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm pretty. I was a journalist for a long time, and sort of you think in word count. So I'm pretty religious about. I record my word count like every day. So I've got these like. I used to do it on an app, but then the app crashed. It was just like a note taking or a calendar app. But like I've got this thing going back a couple of years.
Wow.
Just like every day my word count, because it's like. I don't know, you just like to keep yourself on the street. It's like when you don't wet the bed and you get the gold star on like the puppy dog calendar. You want to keep the string going.
Yeah. Let's see, I've got a couple of comments here. Oh, Heather. Hi, Heather. Heather Grudenhoff is a local author. She writes thrillers and suspense novels. We love her. She's reading the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires and loving it.
Oh, thanks.
And Bill is another great friend of our bookstore, and he just finished Final Girl Support Group, and loved vampires as well. So
cool. Thank you.
What inspires you to write the most? Where do you draw your inspiration from?
Well, I mean, I got a mortgage, I mean, that's ultimately like, this is my job, and so it's not, it's weird. It's, I mean, I hate to make it sound so prosaic, but this is what I do. I was a journalist for a really long time. And in 2008, those jobs all went away. In the financial crash, I did cultural coverage for places like Variety and stuff like that, and no one wanted that stuff anymore. Like they all were doing it in-house, and so I sort of decided to double down on a dead end and start writing fiction. And gosh, in 2009, I went to the Clarion Workshop, which is a genre fantasy and science fiction writers workshop.
I'm familiar with it. I work with, I'm on staff for the local science fiction and fantasy convention here. So
oh, got it. Yeah. So I did that, and then God, I think in about 2014, I sold this book Horror Store about a haunted IKEA, and just kept going. It's what I do. I sort of, I don't know what my life looks like without it. So
awesome. So just want to, if anybody has any questions, to go ahead and unmute yourself, or go ahead and drop the questions in the chat. We'll get to you. How did you know you wanted to become a writer? I know you said you started as a journalist. Was that something you went to school for? Did you always want to be a journalist? Did you always want to be writing in your life?
No, when I was a kid, I didn't. I did a lot of theater and stuff, and I really wanted to do theater. I wanted to direct. And in university, I was doing a bunch of plays, and I realized that most of my time was spent making sure people showed up for rehearsals and learned their lines. And because they would all rather be like smoking pot and drinking, and so would I, but I had to make sure they showed up for rehearsals and learned their lines. And so writing was kind of like the loneliest thing. Like, it's like, no, I didn't need other people. Like I could do that by myself. I didn't need friends. And so I started doing that. And then and so I lived in Hong Kong for a little while after college. When I came back to the States, I had this very specific knowledge about like the Asian film industry. And so I used that to start getting some freelance gigs and went from there. And I actually had this weird path into journalism where a friend of mine who was a writer, who was a freelancer, she got me involved. Every year, Richard Branson, who does Virgin, he did a prank every year for April Fool's Day. And he was doing this prank where he was going to put out a fake a version of the New York Times. And so they needed writers. And so all these people from like the Harvard Lampoon or whatever that stuff is, we're all doing it. And my friend was doing it. She's like, oh, you should do this. You're funny. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I started doing that. And a lot of people weren't into it. Like they started doing it, but they didn't. So there was all this work to do. And so I wound up I wrote so many articles for it. I drew some of the editorial cartoons. I did all this stuff. It comes out April 1st, and there was a big party for it, which I think was the point of it for a lot of people. And at the party, I met this drunk guy who was the nonfiction editor at Playboy, and older guy. We were chatting, and a few years previously, or a year previously, I guess, yeah, a year previously, I had I made this documentary about the Confederate flag because I'm from South Carolina, where at the time it was still flying over the State House. So me and two friends of mine from high school drove around all over the South interviewing people. We made this documentary, we sold it to PBS, blah, blah. And I was telling him about it. He's like, oh, you should do an article on that for Playboy. And I was like, yeah, sure. So I didn't really know how it worked. So I wrote a proposal for the article and faxed it to him because that's what you did back then. And he's like, well, we'll just run this as it is. And I was like, what? And so then I had a clip from Playboy. So I could like go out and be like, oh, I write for Playboy here, and all these, and I made up other places. And I was like, but here's the Playboy one. I got it right here in front of me. And so that's sort of helped me get my foot in the door.
Nice. Nice. So we have a couple questions in chat. Tracy says, what draws you to the horror genre?
Yeah, a lot of people ask this, and it's a question that I have a hard time with because I didn't really read horror as a kid. I thought the covers were sort of too gross. They freaked me out. And so as I got older and was writing fiction, I mean, I read Stephen King at like, you find King at like 11 years old, 12 years old. Most people do. And there was some other stuff, but really it wasn't a big thing for me. And then, I watched horror movies with my friends that were a lot of fun, but as I got older, I realized that the stuff I wrote that was horror was the stuff people liked more. So I just, people like something, you do that more.
Mm-hmm.
And there's other things as well. I mean, horror really is the only, horror is very much like the real world, just more interesting. Fantasy and science fiction, I'm generalizing wildly here, but fantasies often takes place in another world, a secondary world.
Mm-hmm.
And science fiction often takes place on another planet or in another time period. And I don't really care. Like, I don't relate to that as much. Literary fiction's contemporary, but it's kind of boring a lot of the time. But horror was like, it was now, it was here. And, there were just vampires and ghosts. And so, that was more interesting. And for a while, weirdly enough, for about 4 years or 5 years, I was the office manager for this parapsychological research group in New York that actually Ghostbusters is based on. Dan and his brother and his dad are all members. And like his first draft of the script, which was much more serious, was based on this place. So I worked there for a while and I was really in their archives a lot. And that sort of opened up a lot of doors. And and horror is really nice because it's the one genre that sort of sits with death, which is really the only thing we all have in common. We're all going to die. We all come with an expiration date, politically, gender, racially. We're different. We're all different, but we're all going to die. And for a lot of books, death is sort of the end. And for horror, it's often just the beginning. So it's always nice, like to be able to be. I kind of think all other genres are kind of wimpy because they're not all about death. Like I'm like, but I get to stare it in the face, and it's it's the thing that's going to happen to all of us. So be prepared.
It's true. Bill Stevens would like to know who some of your writing influences are or influencers.
Yeah, I mean, not really anyone in particular. It changed, like every book I write, I sort of have a spirit animal who like it's just someone I read incessantly while I'm writing it. So like for I'm trying to think who it was for Final Girl Support Group. Oh, the Final Girl Support Group is an exception, but like for Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, it was Shirley Jackson. I read her biography again. I read We've Always Lived in the Castle again. I read a bunch of her short stories again and again. For We Sold Our Souls, it was Chuck Palahniuk. For my best friend's exorcism, I think it was Stephen King, weirdly enough. For the book I'm writing that's coming out next year, it's very, very much Charles Dickens. I'm reading a lot of Dickens, probably way too much. Is it just Dickens? What else am I? Yeah, pretty much Dickens. For Final
Well,
Girl
that
Support,
age that Dickens was writing about was so dark and dreary. You know, I mean, his books
yeah,
sometimes have a little bit of hope, but that was a pretty grimy part of time in London. So,
yeah, and also it's he's super focused on character, you know. I mean, his character, and so I'm really like, I think that's what's really drawing me to him for this. And But for Final Girl Support Group, it was weird because I also like to read in the genre I'm writing,
mhm,
and Final Girl Support Group is kind of about slashers, and that isn't really a literary equivalent. Slashers are movies: Friday the
yeah,
13th, Halloween, Nightmare on
yeah.
Elm Street, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and there's some slasher books, but they're just book versions of the movies. Most aren't very interesting, and so it's a friend of mine who has a slasher or a Final Girl book out this summer called My Heart is a Chainsaw. The exact same thing happened to him, where we were both looking for the literary predecessors, and we both went back to fairy tales. Um, because you think about it, and Little Red Riding Hood is the original slasher template, right? Teenage girl goes in the woods, told not to do something, does it, encounters this sort of male-coded monster, the wolf, and who's much stronger than her, and is going to kill her, and she has to defeat him with guile and cunning and her resourcefulness. And there's stuff with masks and disguises, him dressing up like the grandmother and that kind of stuff. So
I'll never look at Halloween the same way again.
yeah, no, it's a fairy tale. I mean, you know, um, but so for Final Girls, I wound up reading two books, and one of them I read like just kind of several times in a row. But one was Marina Warner's No Go the Boogeyman, which is her history of the boogeyman in folklore. It's a pretty dense academic book, but it's pretty great. But the other one was Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, which is a book of short stories she read in the 70s, wrote in the 70s that were they're sort of feminist retellings of fairy tales, and they're very tactile, they're very sensual, they're very gory, they're very erotic, like, and so I was reading those a lot. So yeah.
Yeah, like I was telling you before we started, we were, for those of you that do like horror movies or the slasher movies, on Netflix, the Movies That Made Us released a new season, and the first three are horror movies, and they talk about Halloween and Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. So they covered Halloween first, and now like know the concept there, and I'm like not gonna look at that movie the same way again. So we have a question specifically about Southern Book Club from Sam. How did you get the idea, and what were the influences for the character James in Southern Book Club? He is absolutely my favorite character from the book, and something about him just intrigues me to no end.
Yeah, well, it's funny actually. If you Google James Harris, you'll see why he's named James Harris. If nothing comes up, try James Harris and Jackson. So you know, I knew this was going to be a vampire book, and with vampires, there's sort of two varieties of vampire. You got to make a decision if you're writing about a vampire: supernatural or not supernatural. And so I decided not supernatural, and so that immediately meant. He's got a reflection. He shows up on film. He can't turn into a bat. You know, he doesn't control minds, cross running water. He's not scared of crosses. But I wanted to keep that he's very long lived, that he's a little bit stronger than your average human being. And the blood, you got to have the blood. And so but the blood doesn't work. Like the human blood supply only has 6 to 9,000 calories in it. And so you can't really live on that for very, you're like going to be killing someone every week, there's going to be all over your front yard. It's not a good survival technique. So I was like, well, what else could you use the blood for? And I was like, oh, he could use it like this dialysis thing to sort of cleanse the impurities from his blood. Because if you're dead, right, you're not generating new white blood cells and all this stuff. And so, I mean, not dead, but, not living. And so, and I was like, it always bugged me that vampires go for the carotid artery, on the neck. Like, I'm like, but if someone comes to work and they've got a hickey, you kind of notice it right away, no matter how much makeup they put on it. And so you're like everyone's going to see that. So put it on the femoral artery down in sort of what my mom would describe as the bathing suit area seemed like a better idea, and also way more disgusting. And then of course fangs don't work, right? Like fangs are usually used to inject something, not to suck something. And so, it'd be like trying to drink, interact with the blood with like two little cocktail straws. So of course he's gonna have, what you do to suck something is you have a proboscis. So he needed a proboscis. And in terms of him as a person, what really inspired him, and the reason it's in the book, is the bridges of Madison County. Because I realized in reading the bridges of Madison County that there's a way of reading that book where he's a serial killer. I mean, he shows up in this town. He doesn't want people to see him. He's a stranger. He's a drifter. He doesn't have any background. He doesn't have any roots. He comes and he goes. He has this intense thing with his one. I mean, that's Ted Bundy, basically. But it's also this archetypal American figure, the cowboy, right? The man with no name, the drifter, Jack Kerouac, or the hobo on the train car with the poetry in his heart. So it was just such an iconic American thing. This sort of super masculine kind of poet. But if you're doing super masculine, you're also like, well, that's also gets into real toxic areas as well.
Thanks for the Bridges of Madison County reference.
Yeah, of course. I know my audience.
Very familiar with those locations there. Now, Bill said he wanted to know if you were doing a signing tour, but you said you were just in Iowa a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. It shows how terrible my social media is. Yeah, I was just I'm from South Carolina originally, and I really don't like states that don't have an ocean or a large body of water on one border of them. But back in 2016, 17, somewhere in there, I did a bunch of Midwestern states as part of a book signing thing, Missouri and a little bit of Oklahoma and Iowa. And I really fell in love with the Midwest. Like, it's so weird. And
that is true. Can be pretty weird here.
Yeah. And like, there's also like, it's so iconic in terms of horror. You've got the cornfields and the scarecrows and the abandoned homesteads and all that stuff, and corn mazes. And so I really wanted to come back. And then Southern Book Club, obviously, I was going to be out there, and my book tour got canceled because there was a pandemic. But then also with Final Girl Support Group, I decided, like, what the hell? I'm just going to go out. So I did the Cedar Falls library system, where I have a really good relationship. But I was staying in Cedar Rapids overnight because I just drove everywhere. I flew out to Detroit and then drove there, and Iowa, down to Missouri and Texas and stuff, and on through. But it was a lot a driving.
Oh, it is. I used to be an admissions counselor. I understand how much driving that is. And it's flat, and it gets pretty boring pretty quickly.
Oh no, I wasn't bored. It was just, it was fun because, like, after I did the Cedar Falls event, and by the way, there was a great used bookstore you guys have called Shady Characters. They've got a really good sci-fi and fantasy section.
Oh yes, they do.
Not great they have a lot of romance, but it's all 2000 stuff. Really good crime section, really good crime section, huge Western section. They're dropping a lot of books, I think, this weekend for horror, but their horror section was a little picked over. But Westerns, crime, and sci-fi and fantasy, they were strong on. But anyways, but so after I did Cedar Falls, I drove down 3 hours to so I didn't have a longer drive the next day. And that was wild, man, because it was about midnight, and it was about 11 to like 2 a.m. and I was doing all these like rural routes, and there is nothing freaking spookier than those stop signs in the middle of nowhere with the blinking red light on them. I owed a couple of bookstores videos for Halloween, so I stopped my car and shot a couple of them at those crossroads, because like you just get that blinking spooky light. No, I wasn't bored for a second, man. I had a blast.
As someone that watches Supernatural, those crossroads, you have to be careful.
Well, it's funny. Crossroads have such a huge thing in horror, right? Because they're a liminal space. They're neither here nor there. They're not here, they're not there, they're in between everywhere. So they used to bury suicides, and they also used to bury executed people at Crossroads, because the thought was their spirit couldn't rest. Right. It wasn't one place, it was a between place. And weirdly enough, they would often stake them when they buried them. They would stake them to the ground so that their bodies couldn't, because it was believed that suicides would sometimes become vampires. So they would not stake them to destroy their, but stake them to stick them to the ground. So I always thought that was really a cool thing with Crossroads, and it's sort of a proto-vampire thing.
And I know that Heather posted this on her Facebook wall, or I think on Instagram I saw it. Is it on Facebook? But there's a place here in Iowa where there's a tree at the middle of a crossroads.
Oh,
it's a pretty famous location. So
a hanging tree or just a tree?
I'm not sure. I'm sure Heather has. I know it plays a part in Heather's next book. So I know she posted about the tree earlier, I believe, this week. So it was for that when you mentioned that came up in my head. So let's see if we've got more questions here in the chat. Does anybody want to come on live and ask a question? You can unmute your speaker or your microphone at any time and just jump in. And feel free to keep dropping questions in the chat. We're loving those. So this is another question about Southern Book Club. Did you know people like members of the book club that Patricia was a part of? This is from Sam again. I was a kid in the 90s and though I lived in Maryland, not Georgia, I can definitely think of a few moms that were very similar to some of the women described in the book. I just wanted to know if you had known anyone like them personally.
Well, it's funny. Everyone in my books is, I don't have a whole lot of imagination. So everyone in my books is based on someone real. It could be someone I saw on the subway. It could be someone I know really well. Usually by the time they're on the page, they're really different from who they are in real life. But they all start with someone, and no one's ever recognized themselves in my books. Although there are people who are like, oh, I know who so-and-so is, and they're always wrong. So yeah, everyone in that book club is someone I knew at some point. And it's very much based on my mom's book club, not necessarily the people in my mom's book club, but my mom's book club is in year 42, I think. So like they've been meeting since I was like 6 years old, and I hated them with a passion as a kid. And I've gotten to know them as adults, and really going from sort of thinking these women were a bunch of sort of stupid lightweights who read boring books and just talked too loud and all that. And they would just talk about these dumb, boring books and drink too much wine, to going to really knowing who they were as people and having a lot of respect for them. It was kind of the journey I want to take readers on with the book as well.
So another question here. I'm curious about your method for planning and plotting books. I tend to make scrapbooks in a sense, plotting out the feel of the characters in certain scenes, but I love learning what other authors do. So what are your methods for plotting out your books?
Poor. Because usually the plot is the least important part to me. So it's funny. I usually have a really good idea for the book. I write a draft, and the draft sucks. And that really, I really discovered that when I did My Best Friend's Exorcism, which is a book it's set in 1988 in the same neighborhood as Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, the neighborhood I grew up in. It's about two girls, and it's a satanic panic, and one of them is convinced that she's possessed by Satan. Hijinks ensue. And I did a draft of that book. I thought it was really good. Like, it was really tight. It was like a really smart idea, really well plotted. And I gave it to my wife to read, and she was like, this is some hot flaming garbage. And she was right, it took me a little while to realize that, but she
gotta
was
love the honesty.
Yeah, well, that's what spouses are for. and so I realized that I basically recycled a lot of other people's ideas about the 80s and high school in the 80s. You know, it was like I was stealing a lot from people. And so I really sat down and I reread all my old diaries and looked at the pictures and letters and stuff. And spent about 2 weeks. I would rewrite the letters, you know, just to get a feel for like what that felt like to write that again. And I really realized it took about 2 weeks to start remembering what it was like. And I remember that, you know, high school wasn't what we're told it was. It was, for me, it was really scary. I was scared pretty much all the time. Like I was scared. I was, you know, eating my sandwich wrong. I was scared I had the wrong sandwich. Like everything, you were being told constantly by adults that whatever you were doing next could ruin the rest of your life. And it was really a terrifying time. And so I realized that. So usually what happens, I write a draft, throw it out. And then I usually write another draft, and about 2/3 of the way through, I run out of gas. And so then I sit down and I do backstories for all the characters, backstory. And then I usually do a third draft, and that's where I'm starting to get closer. And one of the things I realized is, and I don't know, this may not be of any interest to anyone, but I realized this thing that I was doing, and I'm still bad at this. I'm still really inefficient, getting a little better. But the problem is plotting stuff out. No one really cares. No one cares about your plot much. If you're writing a murder mystery, maybe, sure, I guess. But people are really there for the characters. And one of the biggest problems I see people make over and over again, like other writers and myself, is a lack of patience. You want to get to writing the next cool thing, the next cool scene, all this, and you don't take the time to really unpack what's going on. You don't have the patience to really sit with the characters and put them out there, like really dissect them and open them up. And that's what people are there for. People are there to see other people. I do a lot of screenwriting, and two early movies of mine that got produced were very low budget horror movies. One's like a horror movie about the War of 1812, probably the only one that will ever get made because it didn't do very well. And the other one's a movie called Satanic Panic about a pizza girl, and she winds up delivering pizzas for all these rich Satanists who are raising their demon god, because and like, you know, raising a demon, it's long. You gotta have snacks. So they've ordered pizza, and then they've lost their virgin. They realize she's a virgin. So it's like pizza girl versus devil worshippers. And the directors made me sit and watch the movies with an audience, which was horrible. But it was hugely educational, because what I realized is, for all the cool set pieces and the gags and all this stuff I had in there, where people really leaned forward and got involved were anytime there were two characters talking. And the less they agreed with each other, the better. And we just want to see people, man. We're monkeys. We want to see other people doing things. And so it's the people we're there for in books, not so much the plot twists and stuff. And so that was hugely educational for me. And that's something I really, really try to slow down.
So will you have a chance to do the screenplays or work with any of the treatments for the two of yours that are being adapted into the movie as well as the series? Or are you
Oh
hands
yeah,
off
yeah,
in
yeah.
that process?
Yeah, no, I started out with this belief that I didn't want to be involved, and then a horror store about the haunted IKEA was getting made into a TV series, and they couldn't get it going, and I finally saw the scripts for it, and I was like, oh, this is really, like, really, they're sort of like missing the point of this here a little bit. And I don't think it was because they were dumb or anything. I think they had a bigger idea or a different
Mhm.
idea. And I'm like, but that's sort of, you're missing the engine that makes this work. And so now I'm super involved. Like, I'm a producer on all of them. Horror Store is getting made into a feature film by the producers who did this movie called 1917 about World War One.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and they did a movie called Black Swan,
Uh-huh.
and about ballet horror stuff. And so I've written that, and that's out with directors right now. And I'm producing Final Girl Support Group, which is going to be a TV series on Amazon that Charlie Theron is producing and doing it with her. And Final Girl Support, Southern Book Club is going to be a TV series as well, and I'm producing on that. And just, I want to be able to read scripts and give notes and be like, I know you're going over here, but let's come back over here.
Will you have a guest starring role in any of them?
Oh God, no. Yeah, that's I'm incredibly good looking, and I feel worried that people are going to get hung up on that and ignore the other actors, and so I just don't think it's a good idea.
I know I'm a huge fan of Outlander, so I know Diana's had the opportunity to be in a couple of the episodes. So I always ask when I know that when the author's involved in the adaptations of their work.
Yeah.
So Bill Stevens says, any teasers for the new book?
Yeah, so the new book's called How to Sell a Haunted House. It's going to be out next summer, and it's I don't want to talk too much about it, but it's basically it's about brothers and sisters, and also about evil puppets and evil dolls. So brothers, sisters, evil dolls, and puppets. There's something that, it's funny. One of my sisters-in-law pointed out to me that she's like, how come all your characters are only children? And I realized that in Best Friend's Exorcism, like, my main characters were both only children, and you see that a lot in books. And the reason is it's hard to write families. It's really hard. So I'm just leaning into it now. But like, to write this brother and sister in How to Sell a Haunted House, I just sit down and sort of do the backstory of their family. So I've got this like 35,000 word year by year history of their family that starts before the parents meet and ends in 2021. Just because families are all about backstory. You know, you got to know the relationship, and so that was really important to get right. So it's one of the few times I've actually done all that unpacking work up front.
Nice. Bill also wondered if you have any short stories in any anthologies anywhere.
No, I mean, I've done a couple. There's an anthology called The Mad Scientist's Guide to World Domination. Then I've got a story in called Mofongo Knows that I really like. And I've got a story called The House That Love Built in an anthology called What the Fuck Is That? Or What the Bleep Is That? I don't know how exactly they do it, but short stories are hard, man. It takes a really long time to do it. And I've got an anthology in this 80s anthology coming up, and I can't remember what it's called, but the story's called Stranger Danger. But it's coming out from Soft Skulls Press or Raw Dog Screaming Press, one of those. But I just find short stories, they take me 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and you get what, $150 for them, $200. Like, it's just I wish I was better at them. I wish I was more proficient, but I'm just not.
It's hard to pack a lot into such a small word count. I think there's a real art to novellas as well as short stories, I feel.
Yeah, and also I like characters hanging out. Like, I really like the characters to hang, and there's just no time to hang in a short story.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Chris.
Hi. Okay, Chris.
I turned my video on and then my headphones went off, so I'm going to leave my video off just to make sure. Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm kind of fascinated with the discussion that you're both a screenwriter and an author, mostly because I'm sure Terry will laugh. My daughter lives in Burbank, California, and went out to go to school to be a screenwriter.
Oh.
And so she works at the New York Film Academy in their screenwriting department while she's kind of, so one of the things that she always talks about is doing drafts and then getting notes from people to help you with ideas and tell you what works and what doesn't. Do you have a group of people that you use to bounce ideas off of, or to give you notes or to review? Because I know, at least from her, everything is so iterative. It's never the first one you do. It's always, how many drafts and everything. And screenplays, especially, if you look at where they start and where they end, they're usually quite a bit of a difference between them. So how does that process work? I'm just kind of curious, because I have input from my daughter.
Yeah. So one of the things for me is, having written for, like, being been a freelancer for so long, you have an editor, and editors don't really care about your feelings. They care about word count, they care that it's in on time, and they care that it's accurate. And then they'll often change it to house style or something they want in there. And so I early on really got broken of the idea that you do this alone. My wife always reads early drafts. Now that I didn't have an agent for a very long time. Now I have an agent. They read early drafts. Man, everyone reads. I have friends of mine I give early drafts to. I really work it through with people. I want a lot of people reading it. And I've written a ton of screenplays, only 2 of which have been produced, but that's the way it goes. But in all this time, I've never gotten a bad note. Even if a note is ridiculous, there's always a note behind the note. It's not working for that person. Something isn't working. So figuring out what it is really important to me. I think it's Neil Gaiman who said, like, if someone tells you something's wrong with what you've written, they're always right. If they tell you what it is that's wrong, they're always wrong. And he's right. Like, no one can tell me. If someone doesn't like something, I can fix it. But when they tell me how to fix it, I just stop listening. Because usually if it's a problem in the book, the problem's in the beginning, not the middle or end. But so I wrote this script. So there was that new Twilight Zone that Jordan Peele produced. And I pitched the production company an idea for an episode. And they were like, oh, that's cool. You should do, that'd be really cool. We're already shooting the first season, but we're planning a season 2. So why don't you do a 1-pager? So I did a little 1-page synopsis. They liked that. They passed it up the chain. So then I talked to the producers on the show and they're like, oh, we really like this. We really want you to expand it. And I was like, yeah, sure, no problem. Expanded it. And then I expanded about like a 12-page synopsis. And they really liked that. And so I then took it to like a 22-page synopsis, or like a treatment for this episode. And it went to the showrunner, and they're like, look, we just had a script drop out of season 1. This will be it. And I was like, great. And the thing was basically, it was like a version, a riff on Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart. And it was about a guy who became very famous, and after he became very famous on sitcoms, playing like this dad in this family, and hugely successful, but he really wanted to be taken seriously as an actor. So when we meet him, he is funding a Broadway run of this one-man show he's put together based on Edgar Allan Poe's life. And the big set piece in it is his performance of the Telltale Heart. And he does it all by himself. And he notices that there's a new stage manager, and then it turns out she's this woman, and he thinks she's out to get him, and it turns into this whole thing. So, and it all takes place sort of on the days running up to opening night, and then on opening night. So, and he sort of has this nervous breakdown while doing the show, doing Telltale Heart. And so the showrunner comes in, everyone comes in, and they're like, dude, we're going to script. This is fantastic. Before we do contracts, we've got one note, and we never have one note. There's never one note. And this is the only note we have for this. And so let's just, we're in business. I was like, great. They're like, so he can't be an actor and it can't be a show on Broadway. I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, that's the whole point. Like that. And so I was so pissed off, and I was like, yeah, cool. And I figured it was dead. And then I realized what I could do. And I basically made it a celebrity chef, and it was open. And sort of he was a TV chef before, and and now he was opening a serious restaurant. And it actually worked better this way. So even though that note was like, most people would be like, oh, this is the stupidest note I ever got. For me, I was like, no, it actually, as crazy as it was, it wound up making it so much better. So yeah, I really like working with other people. For me, the really hard thing about screenplays is that books are relentlessly internal. You're always in someone's point of view for the most part. Screenplays are totally external. You can't show someone thinking about something. That is impossible to do. And the most boring thing to show in a movie, and you see people do this all the time in scripts, is someone making a decision. you cannot depict someone making a decision on, you can't do it. You can show their decision, but you can't show someone changing their mind and making a decision. It's just impossible. And so when I did the screenplay for Horror Store, the two big moments in that are a character who gets trapped and sort of reflects on their life and realizes how pathetic it's been, and a character making this decision, changing her mind to make another decision. So it's the two big critical moments in the book are completely unfilmable. So that was this hugely educational thing for me, where I realized what an incompetent hack the guy who wrote the book is. And thank God they hired an amazing screenwriter to fix it.
Yeah, one of the worst things, I get a lot of feedback about movies from my daughter because she has a hard time looking at them just for entertainment anymore. She's looking at all the things underneath.
Oh, that sounds terrible.
No, I keep telling her I feel sorry for her because
Yeah.
you have to just let that go. But anyway, what drives me crazy in movies is when you have somebody who's just explaining something. You're
Sure.
having a conversation that's just giving you background information. There's got to be there are more creative ways to do it than that. But you
Sure,
see enough
yeah.
movies where you go, they're being kind of lazy because they're just having these, or the trope where you've got the villains got the hero and they are going to spend a half an hour explaining everything in time for the cops to show up,
Yeah.
those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So well, thanks for the
Yeah, of course.
information. I could probably monopolize your time, but I'm really enjoying getting a chance to talk to you. It sounds like you've got an incredible background, a lot more than the books. I wasn't aware of all the screenplay stuff, so that's pretty cool.
No, I've been around. I'm old.
Oh, don't even go there.
No, but it's funny. You're saying that actually because I read very little modern horror. And mostly, but one of the issues I have is I'm always like trying to rewrite the book as I read it, which is really frustrating. But also just like I did this book a while back called Paperbacks from Hell, which is sort of a history of the horror paperback boom of the 70s and 80s. When the horror paperbacks were everywhere with those crazy covers, and so I read hundreds of books to do that book. And I've sort of I keep writing about those books, and I work with a small press called Valancourt to bring them back into print. So we're always looking for new books to bring back into print, and I write introductions for them. And I'm doing an introduction for this book from 1984, I think. I'm reading a lot of that author's books to interview him and write the introduction. And then I do these one-person shows instead of author events when I'm promoting a book. And so often when I'm done writing the book, I'll read a ton of books in that area to do the show. So with Southern Book Club's Guide to Sane Vampires, I only really read 2 books about vampires to write that. A book by Montague Summers who was this crazy Anglican priest who wrote all these nutty books about witches and werewolves back in the sort of the turn of the century, the last century, like the 20s and the 30s. But they're really good collections of folklore. And but he really believes in this stuff. He's really bonkers. He really believes that there are witches stealing penises and hiding them in boxes.
Oh boy.
And witches do that a lot. That's a pretty common thing for witches. And a lot of the old witch hunting stuff, you would check bird nests for missing penises and often find them hidden there. So I read Vampire in Europe, and then I read Dracula, and that was it. But when I finished it, I was going to be doing this one-man show about vampires and all this stuff. So I just read everything and watched everything and was really ready to do it. And then, of course, there was a pandemic, which is ironic because vampires are always about pandemics and historically. And so I wound up doing a podcast for it, which it's on my website. It's 7 episodes, but it was just so much work. Once I got 7 hours of material, I was like, I'm tapping out. But it's up there if anyone's looking for a way to waste a few hours. So most of what I read is stuff in these boxes behind me. I've got my Killer Kids books, my Animal Attack books. I'm working on something right now. So I was just reading this old William Sleater book called Among the Dolls.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so stuff. I was going to be reprinting some of Chetwynd Haynes's ghost stories, so reading those. But yeah, so these boxes and all this stuff behind me are just full of stuff. So I mean, everything I read is mostly from 1995 or earlier, which makes me feel out of touch. But can't, it's my job.
But it sounds like
Oh,
you're finding some
that's great.
gems if you're working to bring some books back into print that are no longer in print.
Yeah. Well, it's fun. I mean, it's interesting because, one of the things that was really weird to me is a lot of people feel like horror is this sort of guy's genre, and it's really not. I mean, the first horror novel that anyone still reads for fun is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And then, the biggest novelist of the 18th century was Anne Radcliffe writing Gothics. And the big horror novel before Ira Levin's Rosemary's Baby was Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. It was sort of the only one that ever hit the New York Times bestseller list.
Fabulous book.
Right. And and so throughout the 80s, there was Stephen King, but the other two big writers in horror were Anne Rice and V.C. Andrews. So, and going back through a lot of these older books, you realize there were a ton of women writing horror in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, but a lot of them fell out of print, or, and a lot of them didn't have, Stephen King sort of is a book a year, if not two, for 30 something years. So he tends to overshadow kind of everyone, but there were so many women writing. And so it's been really fun to bring a lot of them back into print as well and sort of rebalance the narrative. I mean, Barry Wood's The Tribe was a huge bestseller in '81. And it is the big work of Jewish horror fiction. I mean, just probably the major Jewish horror novel.
There's actually a biography of V.C. Andrews coming out this next winter, February 2022, written by her ghostwriter. And
Andrew Niederman.
I'm reading it right now. It's fascinating.
Oh yeah. Oh, I got to get an advanced copy of that. Well, Andrews is a real hero of mine. She was an amazing human being. And Niederman actually was a decent author under his own name. He wrote a great book called Pen, about two kids whose a brother and a sister whose dad always sort of communicated emotions to them. He was widowed, through his plastic anatomical dummy. And then when the dad dies, they believe that the dummy's alive, and they always thought it was alive. And they wind up having this sort of like incestual three-way family with the dummy. And then he wrote another great book called Brainchild, about this 10th grade girl who's like really, really super smart. And but she's only into hard sciences, and someone convinces her to sort of audit some classes on social science and psychology, and she does it. She's like, oh, this is really interesting. And so she turns her house into a giant Skinner box, basically running experiments on her family, and sort of social engineering them into the worst versions of themselves. And like everything just falls apart. Like
sounds like what I do when I play The Sims.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like a bad version of The Sims. Like, but so he was a really terrific writer under his own name. Oh, thanks for putting up that thing to the Super Scary Haunted Homeschool, the podcast for vampires. But another book we put out, or two other ones that were really phenomenal, is Joan Sampson's The Auctioneer, which I always describe as Cormac McCarthy writing Stephen King's Needful Things. And it was a big bestseller when it came out in the 70s, and is a real American classic. It was written during the whole Back to the Land movement, when everyone was sort of moving to the countryside. And it's a real snapshot of that era. And Joan Sampson, who wrote it, was really going to do some amazing stuff, but she died about 3 months after it came out of brain cancer. And then the other one is this book called When Darkness Loves Us by Elizabeth Engstrom, who was another big horror novelist in the 80s. And When Darkness Loves Us were two of her novels that were put out as one volume. And When Darkness Loves Us is the first one. It's this really harrowing story about motherhood. And then the other one's called Beauty Is, and it's this horror Flowers for Algernon book that's really heartbreaking. And she wrote another book called Black Ambrosia, which is a vampire book, kind of, that takes place in the Midwest, which is really phenomenal, that we reprinted also. So yeah. And then if you're the other author I'd throw out there is Michael McDowell, who we've reprinted some of his stuff, who's a phenomenal writer. And he was a gay writer who's most famous for writing the screenplays for Nightmare Before Christmas and Beetlejuice. But he wrote these Southern horror novels the Elementals, the Blackwater Saga, that are just astonishing. They're really great. And so all this stuff, it's called, the company's called Valancourt. But you can find them online and all this stuff's available there, but they're really putting out some amazing stuff.
I'm asking Bill Stevens. I know he's a big horror reader. If he's read any of the titles that
I'd be
you've
surprised
mentioned.
if he hadn't. Yeah. What's interesting, Valancourt really started out reprinting. They were out to reprint queer fiction that had fallen out of print, because they were like, the canon is so messed up and unbalanced because so much of it's out of print. And they've reprinted so many gay authors from the teens and the 20s and the 30s on up through the 50s, and these areas that are largely thought of as these sort of black holes of gay literature. They're like, no, there were all these people publishing. They just, the publishers were small. They went out of print. They didn't make it into academia. They were sold as popular fiction or pulp fiction. And so, they've really rescued so many authors from obscurity. And from there, they got into Gothics. McDowell's The Elementals is really phenomenal. It's such a great book. And you can see a lot of Beetlejuice in it, in the relationship between the daughter and her dad in that book. It's very Winona Ryder in Beetlejuice. Oh yeah, Kath Koja, The Cipher. That's one we wanted to reprint, and Kathy didn't want us to do it because she had it as an ebook. She was publishing herself and was doing quite well with it. But The Cipher is this amazing book that came out in the late 80s, early 90s, about this young sort of artsy couple who find a hole in their storage space that leads to nowhere, and things sort of unravel from there. And please don't mention The Nest, Phil. People are going to get the wrong idea. The Nest is a book it's a killer cockroach book, and it's basically, we reprinted it because it's so ridiculous, but it's just cockroaches eat everything. They eat people, they eat children, they eat animals, they eat buttholes, unfortunately. They just eat everything. And it's so ridiculous. But killer animal books are really where I found my sweet spot, because I love the idea that like one day just crabs or caterpillars or roaches or geese are just like, I've had it, done, no more, and just start eating people. So
I think
good.
one of the episodes of the original CSI series that always sticks in my head is one where a little girl, they find a body of an older woman in her house, and she was a cat lady, and the cats had started eating her body. That isn't what killed her. That was more disturbing too. But the fact that the animals live with us, but they are animals.
Well, every time your dog licks you, it's tasting you. And we are delicious. I think that's the glass half full version of that, is we are delicious.
My cat likes to lick me a lot. I'm really scared, Grady.
You are a buffet, and the cat's getting a preview of coming attractions.
Awesome. Well, we have about 3 minutes left. So if anybody else has any questions before we wrap up, just, you can unmute yourself or drop them in the chat. We'd love to get that burning question answered for you tonight.
Yeah, shock me.
Do you have a favorite book, or a book that you can say that you hated enough to have not finished?
I don't think I've ever not finished a book. I'll soldier through. I'm a pretty fast reader, so I'll get there. Favorite book, it really changes a lot, but a couple of books I'm always going back to. Shirley Jackson's We've Always Lived in the Castle, I'm always going back to. Michael McDowell's Blackwater trilogy, which is it's 6 paperbacks he published in the early 80s from Avon. Valancourt's brought it back into print as this massive book, which is kind of a bummer. I wish we had done the individual paperbacks, which is too expensive. But it's essentially the story of a family in Alabama from about 1920 to about 1960. And one of them happens to have married a river-dwelling amphibious monster. And it's a beautiful book. It is the 100 Years of Solitude of horror paperback fiction.
Wow.
Another book I always sort of, yeah, it really is that. I'm prone to exaggeration, but it really is that good. I'm looking around to see what's here because I mean, those are sort of the two I'm always going back to. Yeah, that's sort of, we've always lived in the castle and the Blackwater saga are really books I just keep returning to. Uh, yeah, that's sort of, those are my jams.
That's great. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, of course.
I think Bill has the best last question we're going to ask tonight, Grady.
Oh,
Where
yeah.
do you purchase your suits?
Oh, yeah. So I've got a tiger suit I've got that I had made for me, and a pink suit that I had made for me. But a lot of my stuff, there's a men's store that just went out of business in Charleston, South Carolina, where I'm from. And whoever was their buyer had really good taste. And I would always shop there because Southern men are peacocks and they really like to dress flashy. And the other one, there was a store downtown, a suit store. There was Bluestein's, and then next door to it was Superbad King of Fashion New York, and they were amazing. They were for Black men, and no one dresses better than Black men do. I mean, it is just, I'm sorry, it's just phenomenal. I went to a white flight Southern school. It was like, we had 11 minority students, including the Asian kids in grades 1 through 12. And so I went to a friend of mine's public school prom, which was a much more diverse class. And I was like, holy cow, people with canes, gloves, top hats, tails. I was like, I want to be this. This is what I want to be. And so I started buying my suits at Bluestein's and Superbad King of Fashion New York. And man, I used to have some great double-breasted lavender and canary yellow and bright parrot green. I mean, they were some gorgeous suits. So yeah, but those are sort of my standbys. But Bluestein's, Superbad King of Fashion, the other men's store I went to, all out of business now. So I got to find somewhere new.
Well, good luck with that.
Thanks.
Well, that we are at 8:30. We want to thank you for your time tonight, Grady.
Yeah.
I know it's getting late where you're at, and we want to be respectful of your time and hope that the next time you travel to Iowa that you'll stop by and see us here in Cedar Rapids and Marion.
I will. It's inevitable. This, like a curse, it will happen.
Sounds great. We'll try to have, if it's the fall, we'll go on a corn maze together.
Oh, absolutely. I haven't done one of those ever, and I want to. Just scared of being eaten by scarecrows.
Or the children that are in there.
Exactly. Bye, y'all. Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Good night.